They say the city forgives almost everything, as long as the light keeps catching the right surfaces. It is a city that polishes its sins until even the scars look like ornament. I went for the lights that night. The chandeliers, the gold-stamped invitations, the camera flashes that pretended to be applause. It sounds prettier than the truth. The truth was simpler and colder. I wanted distance. Distance from the small, hungry conversations that followed me from table to table. Distance from the way people mistook my presence for a promise. The charity hall smelled of lemon oil and expensive linen. I wore silence like a shawl and let people lean into it. I watched them catalog me the way they cataloged the art on the walls. Something to admire, to auction, to talk about in the morning. I had been good at this for years, wearing elegance like armor, choosing my smiles like investments. I knew the ledger of influence in this town. I was one of the columns. That night, though, someone had been following me for 3 blocks before the first server bumped into my elbow and offered condolences about a late donor. The tale had not been discreet. It had been the kind that wants to be noticed, to send a message. It left yellow sticky notes on the back of my car seats and a business card in the glove compartment that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and late-night threats. It began to rain when I left the hotel, a fine, arranged rain that made haloed umbrellas blossom and blurred the streetlights into coins. I stood on the curb under my own umbrella and felt the city peel itself back into water. A man approached with measured steps, as if he had been sent ahead by the rain. He had a presence that did not seek permission, someone who had been given corners of the map and kept them. He carried an umbrella the color of old authority. He moved like a man who did not ask to be addressed, he asked to be obeyed. He was not handsome in any deliberate way. He had the kind of face that weathered favors and debts. A pale scar cut across his cheek, less dramatic than a story and more convincing as history. He handed me a card with his name on it in a font that suggested discretion. Dante Moretti. The card smelled faintly of the cologne of offices where decisions were made and closed. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," he said. His voice matched the umbrella, carefully broad, raised to shelter. I told him, because it was easier than the lie of indifference, that I had security. He smiled as if I had confessed something charmingly naive. "You do not," he said. "Not in a city that breathes through other people's mouths." The man who could make things disappear shouldn't say things like that to a woman on a rainy curb. It should have been theatrical, a line from a film, a moment I'd later exhale about with friends over coffee. Instead, it felt like a diagnosis. I let the rain steady me into common sense. "Why tell me this?" I asked. My voice felt like something I had rehearsed in the mirror, level, not pleading. He did not give me the answer I expected. He did not offer a limousine or a driver or promises. He offered a week. 1 week under his roof, he said, to see if he could keep me safe. 1 week to prove he could be a shelter and not a cage. The thing about offers like that is that they arrive already weighted. He knew my reputation. He knew, because everyone like him knows, the currency of a week. It was both more and less than I wanted. Less because a week is no defense against slow, patient harm. More because sometimes shelter is not about time, but about the idea that someone will not let you fall. "You don't know me," I said. "I know enough," he replied. His eyes were not idle. "My men have been watching the wrong kind of attention. I can stop it." He smiled like a man who had already understood the answers of women he had met before. He folded the umbrella and stepped back into the rain in a way that made anyone not carrying the weight of unsaid things look foolish for standing in the downpour. He left me with the key on the curb, chilled by the rain. It felt heavier than the card, as physical and banal as the hinge between rooms. I could have pocketed the key and left it there. Instead, I put it in my palm and felt it cool me from the inside. That evening, I didn't sleep so much as wait. Waiting was an old skill. I called my friend Anna and lied about a scheduling change, then called no one and let the rain dry. I took the key out of my bag and turned it between my fingers until my knuckles went white. Then I put it back in a jewelry box with other small tokens. 2 cufflinks from a man who loved to apologize, a coin from a childhood vacation, the tiny watch my father had given me when he thought the world would simply bring more time. At 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a message. 1 word, no punctuation. "Are you coming?" I am not an impulsive person, but I had been practicing a kind of impulse for years,
the impulse to choose my own inconvenience over someone else's narrative. I texted back, yes. The car that arrived was not the glossy black of a show, it was matte, practical. Marco opened the passenger door for me. He was younger than I imagined, not quite as stoic, with a face that had begun to carry worry like a habit. He introduced himself, said nothing other than the route and the approximate time. He handled the seatbelt with a delicate competence and did not ask for stories. In the mirror, Dante's silhouette looked like a man who could make judgments of whole blocks of the city and have them obeyed. The house was not a mansion in the sense of gilded excess, it was a compound that had learned restraint. It sat back from the street like something that wanted to be both seen and invisible. A tall gate, an unmarked façade, and behind a hedge, glass that reflected the night like a second sky.
The staff met me at the threshold. Rosa, the steward, small and precise with linens folded like promises, Marco, who carried a half smile and the weight of someone who had seen more than he was permitted to say, and another man I would later identify as an analyst, elbows always dusted with screens. Rosa watched me with a particular clarity. She did not pity or admire me. She listed what she would do for the house as if reciting the names of rooms. We keep the kitchen quiet until 7. We do not accept flowers with strings attached. If you wish to lock the west door, I will do it at your command. Her voice carried the cadence of someone who knew when to speak and when to let the walls. Dante walked me through rooms that were obedient to function. There was a study lined with books that were used more as reference than display, a small library with chairs that held confidence. There were monitors behind glass in a room that smelled faintly of ozone and coffee. He did not pretend not to watch the city. He said, when he could not be otherwise honest, we see things, we keep them in registers, we mark them for risk. I asked questions as I stepped through the house. I asked because questions were my instrument. Who was watching? What measures? What rules? How much of my life would be recorded in that ledger? Dante answered with the kind of precision reserved for men who had paid for clarity. No hidden cameras, I said. No microphones in my bedroom or bathroom. Full logs accessible to you with timestamps. You tell me who you contact about threats. I decide who remains for the week. I can leave when I say so. No violence without my explicit consent. If you want to do anything beyond defensive measures, you tell me and we file it. No unilateral action. He listened like a man weighing a list of meats in a market, making choices less by taste than by value. Then he nodded. Agreed, he said. There was a moment where the key passed from the ring on his finger into my palm again, the key that had been an ornament on the curb. He held it out, and I felt the cool metal and the small heft of choice. He did not clasp the ring around my neck or slip a chain into my palm like a leash. He placed it calmly in the hollow of my hand, and when I closed my fingers around it, he let go. The gesture meant something different than possession. It was, in that precise instant, a question articulated in metal. Will you keep this door open? I left my signature on a thin line of paper that read, Consent and Transparency Agreement. It was not a legal document so much as a letter of expectation, but it mattered because consent matters when architecture of power looms around a body. There were lines that prevented unilateral measures and promised auditability. Who opened which camera, who accessed which log, what names were called in the dead of night.
I insisted they be logged and time-stamped, and Dante accepted the demand like a man who could afford more friction than most would think. We shook hands over the paper, a cold, dry palm press. Marco watched us with his eyes on us and his mind somewhere else. Rosa folded the paper, placed it in a drawer, and made a note in her ledger. That night, the monitors glowed like a second sky. Dante told me they were not for him to control alone. The analyst would provide redacted logs. If anyone called on the property line, Rosa would record it. Marco would respond physically only if I asked. The agreement was like a chord struck into the house, clear, resonant, fragile. I expected to feel safe the moment I signed. I did not. I felt less alone. Safety in a city is often less about the absence of threat and more about the presence of witnesses. We had built a little constellation of witnesses in that house, and for the first time in many nights, someone else watched the edges I could not see. The next days unrolled like a slow film. I kept my appointments for interviews and meetings by video from the house. My friends texted that I had the glow of someone in exile who had been tempted back into society. Dante gave me rules that made the house less an arrest than an arrangement. He would not enter my private rooms without invitation. Cameras would be visible and labeled. Any access to my devices would require my explicit permission. He suggested that the house be a place where I could finish fundraising work in peace, and he left molds of his small acts, tea left on a kitchen counter, a note of a poem he liked on the mantel, a selection of his mother's original gardening shears placed on the table like an offering.
He was attentive in a way that made the small things weighty. Once I found him pruning by the greenhouse at dawn. He had dirt under his fingernails, and a quiet in his hands I did not expect. He quoted a few lines of a poem, and then apologized for the intrusion of art into work. "My mother taught me the way things keep themselves," he said. He did not explain how a man who ran influence and budgets learned to prune tulips. He simply worked at the stems as if confession could be physical. I asked the question that makes the most men with secrets stall. Have you ever done things beyond the law in the name of protecting someone? He stopped pruning. He smelled like spring. "Yes," he said. The word was small and terrible. He told me, not as a defense, but as a fact he had to render into language. After his mother's death, after the failure of the police to find closure, he had hired men. He had sent them to scare, sometimes to silence. He used influence in procurement and personnel. He paid off people. He moved money. He had believed for years that the ledger of favors balanced violence with protection. I listened. I was not surprised that a man who had built a city of influence had performed acts in the shadow of the law.
The surprise was in the backward glance, his remorse. He played out the arithmetic of grief. A child loses a parent. The parent of a child seeks an equation to rebalance the world. Power converts that equation into currency. He spoke of names without naming them, of shipments and messages, and men who now had disappeared into records. He did not ask for forgiveness. No man like him had ever believed in forgiveness. He simply spoke the facts and let them land. When he finished, I asked the practical question. "Have you told the DA? Have you turned anything over?" He met my eyes. For all his power, his vulnerability showed there. "Not yet," he said. "I have compiled evidence. I thought I was protecting people. I thought I could mop the floor without anyone seeing the stains. But the stains have begun to speak back." There, in the greenhouse, among tulips, the city's ledger was spelled out to me. Deeds meant to close wounds that had opened other wounds. I felt the presence of all the things he had done, a ledger full of shadows. My hands went unconsciously to the key in my pocket. The key meant choice. It was not a brimstone absolution. "You will not keep doing it," I said. The sentence came like a verdict. Not because I am moral in any superior way, but because the woman who had lived in the city's open rooms had decided she would not be complicit in the ways power redrew boundaries. You bring the evidence to the law. You open your registers. You allow oversight. You give those men names where possible. He listened as if he had been preparing to be told this his whole life. "I will," he said. "I don't know how to begin, but I will." The house, for a few days, resembled an experiment in negotiated power. We held meetings about what constituted necessary protection versus possession. Marco and I talked about lines. He admitted to me, one afternoon at the kitchen counter, when the rain made the world waxed and soft, that he had once been paid to drag a man's memory through mud for less than he thought a life deserved. He had a face that complicated loyalty. He was protective but not blind. Rosa, over tea, argued that stewardship without conscience is only better camouflage for cruelty. She had a ledger of her own. At night, I read Dante's eyes the way other people read his speeches. There was a hardness to him, a set bone, but also a tenderness that frightened him. That tenderness liaised with his power in ways that threatened the agreement we'd written. Power, when tethered to attachment, becomes unpredictable. It can be generous, or it can be exacting. The more he wanted to keep me, the more his tools began to feel poised between shelter and claim. It happened slowly at first. A man outside the gate fixing a light, a wrong car that lingered too long at the corner of the property, a drone that hummed past at eye level. Marco logged them, and Rosa noted them.
Dante called names and ran them through databases, and his face tightened when there were connections. "Calabresi," he said, after a string of men had been traced to a network. "They are not subtle. They test perimeters." Calabresi. The name sounded like an instrument, precise, calibrated. It suggested a family or a faction that ran the same ledger as he did, a reflected mirror. Dante had the power to punch holes in networks. Calabresi had the will to prod, to see how the blinds moved, to check a gate and see which locks were polished. It was one thing to know there's a threat. It is another to feel it when someone walks a boundary that you cherish, when the hollow of your home fills with the wrong shadow. A week after my arrival, men checked the fence line at dusk. They moved in a group, lit by flashlights, and one of them, tall, plain, left a small folded paper atop a bollard so that I found it when I stepped out for my cigarette. The paper said in block letters, "All ownership is claimed." It was not a polite warning. It was a mapping of what they thought the city owed them. I brought it to the kitchen table and Marco took it in gloved hands. His fingers trembled for a second. "They want a response," he said. The phrase was clinical, but the way his jaw tightened made the meaning human. They wanted to know if we would bleed when pushed. Dante convened a perimeter response.
The house became a bell that rung with preparations. Guards came in shifts, cameras were double-checked, and the analysts ran plate numbers and facial matches with the aching efficiency of people who have made a life out of seeing things their owners prefer not to know. The house's sensors were like a chorus, each instrument tuned to the smallest sound. I watched the choreography of protection and felt something familiar and ancient, the city's appetite to read women as something to be owned, to be kept. I also felt the dangerous pleasure of being chosen. Those two feelings do not sit comfortably together. I kept the key in my pocket as a reminder to myself, this is your choice. You walk these rooms because you say so. On the third night of the perimeter calls, when the house went into a partial lockdown, Dante asked me if I wanted to go out. He used we like someone trying to be inclusive. The house had been locked, the gates bolted, the men patrolled. There was a hum in the walls like a second heartbeat. You can leave, he said. It was a sentence that returned me to the curb in the rain where a man and an umbrella had offered a week. The offer was the same as before, an invitation to choose. The difference was that now I knew more of what his power entailed, and the ledger of deeds he had kept secret. It had the taste of consequence. I could have left then, mailed a note to the city telling them to keep their distance. I could have retrieved my bag and walked past the hedges into a night that smelled of wet concrete and fewer promises.
Walking away would have been clean in a way that complicity never is, but I had watched him prune the tulips with his hands, watched him quote a line of poem he loved, watched remorse sit in the lines of his face. There was sorrow in a man who had the means to close wounds and instead opened his ledger to a stranger. He had given me a key. He had let me hold it. Leaving at that moment would have been leaving with a piece of me in his hands. Stay, I said. The words sounded like a verdict and a benediction. I said it because I believed we could try to rewire the ledger. I said it because I wanted to test whether attachment could change a man who had been trained to use his authority as a blunt instrument. I said it because of the small tenderness of a man who had once been a child with a parent, and because sometimes human beings choose to try to turn power into something less predatory. Dante nodded. Then we make the ledger public, he said. We turn over evidence. We make it accountable. He said it not as absolution, but as a plan. I will give names where I can. I will cooperate with the DA. I will return funds misused. I will accept whatever oversight is required. He used the language of repair, and it was a step forward, but my foot was planted on the truth that repair has a price. The city we lived in did not erase stains easily. The men who had been paid to erase other men with hush money had names and families and debts. They would not like being named. Calibracy would not be amused. When one man began to lift the lid, the others would check the seams. The house went into full pseudo-normality for the first few days. Me, Dante, the staff, Marco, and the analyst going through logs. We practiced how transparency would look. Rosa created a schedule for public disclosures of what the house had logged. Marco ran exercises for non-lethal engagement. Dante wrote letters, delegations to his accountants, to his legal counsel. And then, one afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the rain pattern the glass like small maps, the house shivered with a single physical sound, the snap of a twig against the gate. Marco and the men moved like a single thought. The cameras tracked a van moving too slowly across the street. The analyst called names. The kettle shrieked. Dante put down his cup like a man who had practiced the movement of surrender. He looked at me and said quietly, "They test perimeters before the first move." I felt the key in my pocket as heavy as leather. The perimeter had been prodded. We had seen an edge. We had been warned. In that small, precise phrase, in that household choreography of men who could make things disappear and men who could make things appear, the story of the night rearranged itself. My choice was no longer only my own. It had become a public asset, an illustrated problem. I did not sleep that night. I reached for the key a dozen times and held it to my chest as if it could steady my heartbeat.
There was a strange intimacy in that simple metal. It was not a chain. It was a clasp for decisions. When the men outside the gate left an envelope on the bollard 2 nights later, it was no longer a statement about distance. It contained a photograph. It was a picture of one of the staff, Marco, standing at the gate, taken from the side. The image was crisp. Whoever had taken it knew the layout, knew the shifts. They had marked a line. We know which one's Gargu. Dante's face, quiet and composed for so long, showed fracture. He called his people. He called names. He took actions that were precise and not always clean. He moved money on accounts. He placed men on leaves and took others off call. He was a man who controlled corners of the city, and he used that control now as if it were a blunt instrument pressed against the skin of an infection.
I reminded him of our agreement. No unilateral violence, I said. If you want to act, we make it a matter of record. You tell me and we file it. We use the law. He closed his eyes and said, I know. He did not act then. He slowed himself down in a way that felt unfamiliar and brittle. He also began to move paperwork in a way that made the house feel under siege by bureaucracy as much as threat. He arranged a meeting with a DA's investigator in a neutral place the next morning and asked me if I would attend. I said I would. I attended because I wanted to see how a man who had built a city out of favors would begin to dissolve those favors into something recognizable by law. I went in part to hold him accountable, but I also went because sometimes you watch a man who loves you and want to see if love can make him brave in the right ways. We sat across from a woman who smelled of paper and authority, the kind of person who can organize grief into forms. She took notes like a surgeon. Dante spoke with an economy of language I had learned to distrust and, at the same time, to rely upon. He admitted to transfers, to contracts made in the name of protection, to using unregistered contractors. He did not confess to everything. He did not have to. He admitted enough to create ripples. The investigator asked for documents and evidence, and Dante agreed to hand over ledgers previously maintained in private servers. One action, I realized later, can be a hinge. Handing over those papers would tie his name to those acts in ways the coffee clutch and backroom savers never could. It was the sound of a city learning to hold a man to account. When I left the DA's office, the rain had stopped. The air smelled like cut grass and possibility. Dante handed me the key again, as if to remind me that I could always recuse myself. He did not hold my hand. That silence was a kindness. The newspapers did not know the whole story. They do not ask for nuance. They ask for images that do not complicate, headlines that will fit on the morning's coffee.
But paper is persistent, and in a city hungry for narratives, the hint of a scandal is a long shadow. The story leaked like a faucet and then a flood. Names were not yet called, but gossip has its own calculus. People began to ask which men had been paid to disappear and whether the disappearances could be reversed. The city, which enjoys moral discomfort but disdains responsibility, tuned itself to the drama. At home, we kept the rules. Cameras were labeled. Logs were transparent to a small oversight committee that Rosa helped form. A handful of names, independent counsel, a ledger open to those who needed to know. We staged public statements that said, without saying too much, that Dante would cooperate with investigations and that the house preferred the law to vigilante remedies. You would think that making these mechanical changes would calm things. You would be wrong. Power has a stubbornness. Calabresi, which had been testing perimeters like a surgeon tapping a brittle bone, changed strategy. They started making calls to people connected to Dante, soft blackmail, claims of betrayal, offers to renegotiate loyalty. One night, as we all sat quiet in the study, an analyst screen flashed with a location ping, a van tailing the biotech lab where Dante kept a trustee office. The man moved. Marco went outside to the gate and then returned with his face the color of paper. They escalated, he said. His voice had a fatigue to it that a man who had made and broken his own moral codes can never quite scrub off. We prepared for a test. Those words sat between us and the city, promising a demonstration of whether a man could change course when his attachment to a person required more than a guarding hand. It required constraint. I understood, in the small moments when Dante lifted his face to the sky, that his weakness was not simply my presence or my charm. It was the way his power had been asked to soften into something more human, and the difficulty of that conversion. He had built a city out of influence. He had never been asked to unbuild parts of it. He had to choose between the old mathematics of favors and a new accounting that included witnesses and law. Love, mine if you wanted to call it that, was the mechanism that forced the choice. That is what the title of this life might read in a paragraph somewhere. The most powerful man in the city had a weakness, the socialite. It is a tidy line, but reality is knotted. My presence did not redeem him automatically. It made the geometry of his choices more visible. It forced him to face a ledger he had been told was necessary. The night the gate thumped and men in black gathered like punctuation marks, I held the key in my fist until it hurt. The house hummed with the business of people whose ethics had been measured and remeasured. I could see the strain in Dante's jaw. He moved through the rooms with the awkwardness of a man who wanted to protect without piling debt upon debt.
Marco watched the gate. Rosa tabulated names. The analyst kept muttering numbers. Dante put his hand on the table, and I saw him choose. "We wait," he said, and it was less a command than an intention. "We do not fire until we are fired upon." It was an instruction that honored our agreement, but also counted the cost. Outside, someone knocked on the gate in a rhythm that suggested more than mischief.
The house registered the sound on the monitors, and a camera caught the silhouette of a figure pacing beyond the hedges. I thought of the men who had used debt to silence others, and the men who had paid to keep secrets. I thought of the ledger, and the fact that ledgers loved to be read. Hours passed. Men came and went. Tension braided itself into sharper edges. I imagined headlines, accusations, apologies that would not mend tissue. I also imagined a law that had been asked politely, and sometimes it answered. When the lull came, Dante left his chair and opened a small wooden box. He took out a second key, the same make as the first but worn differently, as if its owner had turned it in a pocket for years. He slid it across the table to me and said, "Keep them both." I stared at the metal. He had meant many things. He had meant to share responsibility. He had meant to double bind us with trust. He had meant to give me access and to make a covenant that if needed, we could walk from the house together or apart. Keys do that. They authorize. They choose. I placed both in my hand and felt the responsibility like a small, cool weight. In the kitchen, Rosa poured tea as if the world had not been breached. She moved like someone who believed in small rituals to counteract men with loud answers. Marco came back in and set a cloth over the counter. There was loyalty here, yes, but there was also a moral arithmetic that made people survive. By dawn, we had not been breached. Our perimeter exercise had been met with bluster. It was a relief and a provocation. Calibracy had prodded. They would protract. The house tallied up the night's data and began plotting the city's next response. I did not know, lying awake with the key under my pillow, whether I had done a brave thing or a foolish one. There is a seam between the two, and sometimes courage looks like a stubborn refusal to give in to fear. Sometimes it is just a miscalculation. But the key was there. It was not a chain. It was a tool. It was the hinge between doors and decisions. It was the question I held each morning when I left this house and walked into the light. Will what I touch be for good or for harm? When the sun came up like a promise over the hedges, the house was still standing. The men outside had been terse that night and had returned to their own lives with the leftover taste of challenge. But the thing about perimeters is that testing them invites a response, and responses become histories. At noon, Dante asked if I would meet with him in the study.
He had papers spread out, and for a long time he was silent, more silent than the man who had offered a week on the curb. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at me. "I have made people disappear," he said again, not in justification, but as a fact that now demanded remediation. Some of them deserved punishment, some didn't. I cannot unravel all of it overnight. But I will open the ledger. I will cooperate. I will take consequence. Those words mattered more than the room. They were the pivot point. He had offered me safety in exchange for a week. In exchange, he got me to ask for the law. It is a funny economy. I took the key out of my pocket and placed it on the table between us. The metal looked small and mundane. "You said I could always leave," I reminded him. "You can," he said. "And you will not use your men without my consent?" "I will not." I saw a man staggering toward a future he had not expected. He had begun to translate muscle memory into restraint. That was the experiment we were all running. Could a man who had built a city of favors unbuild what he had created, enough to let the law breathe? Could a woman who had been objectified navigate a path that would use influence for restitution rather than erasure? We did not finish the sentence. We left the papers on the table like seeds. Outside, a courier delivered a note to the gate. A camera flashed across a street. Calibracy was not finished testing. I slid my fingers around the key and felt the day's small closings and openings. The house kept watch, and we kept each other. The city kept polishing its surfaces, and sometimes under those surfaces, something more honest could be found. If you like character-driven suspense and stories that ask what power does when it meets love and law, subscribe. There are no tidy endings in this town, only ledgers and choices, and the occasional key that asks us to answer for what we keep. After the little plea for subscriptions, because even disasters need an audience, the house resumed its patient work of being a small, human machine against a city's appetite. Days layered into each other with the mundane apparatus of accountability, meetings with lawyers, calls with investigators, logs exported and redacted, and analysts' printouts that smelled faintly of toner and inevitability. Dante moved through those days like a man learning new muscles. He learned how to sit and not command a room. He learned how to let a question be asked without answering from memory of favors.
It was difficult to watch him unlearn himself, and harder to watch him remember the old moves when a new provocation arrived. The provocation came on a Wednesday that began like any other. Rain in the morning, a city arranged itself into commutes and obligations. Mid-afternoon, as I was reading a donor's email, Marco knocked and left a paper on the table. "An attempt on one of Dante's trustees this morning," he said flatly. "They followed him from the market."
The word attempt had an ancestry. It sat in the mouth like an accusation. Dante closed his laptop and, for the first time since the Garden Confessions, looked at me in the steady way that had once been a prelude to extreme measures. He did not speak for a long time. "We notify the DA," he said at last. "We put all surveillance into a public archive for the investigator. We file a report." I hitched the key higher in my pocket as if it had become a talisman that could pierce the membrane of the city. The house's protocol, our protocol, was to treat everything as if it could be evidence. Rosa updated the ledger and, with a practiced hand, wrote the trustee's name and the time and the car plates they'd recorded. The analyst queued footage and sent a secure link to the investigator's office. Then they started a pattern we had feared, targeted pressure on the people closest to Dante. A courier left an envelope at the gate holding a single bullet and no explanation. A former contractor's storefront window broke, and a note was left inside that said, in the same blunt script we'd seen before, "Do not unbalance the ledger." The city was a place of messages that arrived as threats and as gossip in the same breath. We called the DA's office the next morning and asked for a meeting that could not be misread as a PR exercise. The investigator we had met before, her hair pulled back, her voice a clearing in the noise, brought a prosecutor with colder shoes. They listened to Dante give more details than he had at first. He handed over digital ledgers, bank records, names he had compiled in the privacy of his servers. He signed affidavits. He placed a key, his house key, into evidence. Not because the DA wanted a key, but because he chose to make the gesture. He walked it across the table to the investigator and said simply, "This is mine. It opens things I should not have been the only one to open." It was a theatrical thing, and yet it was also precise. It mattered because it meant he was volunteering the instrument of his unilateral control. The DA's office cataloged the key and put it in an evidence envelope. We watched the process with a weird mixture of relief and dread. Giving up a key is different from asking to be judged. It is a small, sharp act towards transparency. We were still inside the difficult business of proving that change could happen when the city turned from taunt to violence. It was late on a Saturday when the ambush happened, the moment that we had tried to imagine and had never wanted to make real. Dante insisted on driving me to a meeting. We went with only Marco and an analyst in a separate car. The lane that led out of the compound held the same jacaranda shade we had seen uncounted times, the same light that blurred the difference between afternoon and jeopard. We had not driven more than 2 miles when the van appeared, a boxy thing the color of regret, and cut across us. Tires screamed against wet pavement.
A second vehicle pulled up behind with a deliberate choreography of a plan. Out of the van stepped men with the quiet, unforgiving posture of professionals who had been paid to do one thing and not ask why. They wore nondescript jackets and carried hard, dark cases. The first sound I remember was glass breaking, not a cinematic burst, but a correct domestic sound, as small windows obeyed the pressure and gave. Then a metallic smell rose in the car, the tang of bullets in the air. Marco hit the horn, and for an instant everything in the city seemed to condense into the smell and the motion of people taking up the roles they had been hired for. One of the men ran to the driver's door, yanking it, and I heard Dante shout, not with command, but with disbelief, "Do not fire unless they fire." The rule had been ours, defensive responses only. We had all agreed to it. We had sworn to make it law in that small space of brick and hedge. What came next was a compression of choices and instincts. A man lunged at the passenger side window. Marco, who had trained for 100 contingencies, moved with an apparatus of muscle memory. He drew a weapon in less than a second and fired, not wildly, but with a certainty that came from having done it before. The sound was enormous inside my skull. The van driver's face, as I remember it, took on the bland astonishment of being interrupted mid-motion. One of the assailants fell, a terrible human hinge. Others stumbled back. There was no glory in it. There was blood and an immediate rude arithmetic that did not allow for the kind of tidy answers the city likes to print. Someone in a jacket I didn't know shouted something, and then the van peeled away with teeth grinding. Marco leaned over the dead man like a man checking a clock. He had the look of someone who had been right, and also felled by the knowledge that rightness does not erase consequence. We called for an ambulance. Dante stepped out of the car with his hands visibly not fists. He wanted to touch nothing until the police arrived. Marco sat on the pavement and did not speak. The house's cameras had caught everything. I watched the footage later and found myself surprised by small things. A foot catching on a curb, the way the rain made lights smear like watercolor grief. The microphones on the street had recorded a sound like a broken sheet of metal, and then people's voices becoming emergency. An officer arrived with a helmet under his arm. He set cones and looked at us like a man sorting through allegiances. The paramedics came and worked like people attempting to be household gods who could not rewrite history. The man who had been hit, later identified by the police as a known operative linked to Calabresi, was pronounced dead at the scene. Forensics took photographs, took samples, took the cruel debris of human contact, and made it into evidence.
Marco was handcuffed for a while, standard procedure even when your apparent use of force is defensive, and then released into the custody of detectives to be interviewed. In the days that followed, everything that had been legal and moral and careful unspooled into documents. The police took statements, the analyst printed the time-stamped logs, the DA opened an investigation into the homicide. A coroner's report came back describing one fatal wound and the time of death and, detached and accurate, the presence of GSR on Marco's clothing. The press, which will never long resist a neat narrative, began to construct it. The socialite in the car, the powerful man at the wheel, the hired guardian caught in the act. They painted with the broad brushes of salaciousness. Tabloids found a new hunger in the city for spectacle and fed it. I read headlines with a kind of internal numbness, because public opinion had the lazy function of a weather system. It moved rapidly and relentlessly, and could not be trusted to care for people. The DA had a difficult calculus. We had given them ledgers and keys and confessions. We had handed them the instruments to build a case. The law is not a moral thermometer. It measures statutes and evidence and intent. There was in our favor an argument of defense, an attack on people in the act of aggression. Against us, there was Dante's ledger showing the organization of men and payments that had produced revenge and disappearance before. Marco's action could be framed as defense. It could also be framed as an extension of a system that had been normalized. Dante's choice to step into the DA's office was a moment of political and personal gravity. He did not stroll in as a man seeking to appeal to pity. He walked as a man who had decided the ledger should be readable. He handed over more records, accounting transfers, lists of contractors with dates and locations, messages that had been meant for private consumption. He signed statements, gave sworn testimony in sessions that were sometimes sterile and sometimes corrosive, depending on what he was asked. He did not ask for immunity. He signed consent forms to allow his data to be unredacted in certain cases. He told the investigators what he knew of Calabresi's networks and of the men he had once used. In some instances, he produced names. In others, there were only partials, phone numbers, nicknames, the kind of half-maps that take years of work to convert into a prosecutable case. When the DA eventually filed charges against some of Dante's contractors and low-level operatives, men who had received pay and turned into instruments, there was a ripple effect. Some were arrested, some disappeared into the warren of legal maneuvers their lawyers mounted. Marco was not charged with murder immediately, though he would later be indicted on counts that required complex pleading and a long public examination of intent. The press filed each hearing with predatory delight.
Calabresi's representatives denied everything and leveled counter-accusations. I sat through a lot of the hearings. I watched Dante answer questions in a room that smelled like institutional varnish and coffee. He admitted to sending money to contractors and to using influence for silence. He also said, in plain and abrupt sentences, that he had believed he was doing protection and that he now understood the harm. The prosecutor pressed him on names. Dante names were often the hinge in these stories. When someone of power stops being opaque, the people around them are endangered and vindicated in equal measure. At one hearing, an early, sharp one that made the front pages, Dante was asked if he had ordered disappearances. He looked tired and precise. "I used means I cannot justify," he said. "I engaged people. I was wrong." He took a moment then and added, "I will accept whatever law determines owes to the injured." The line was not absolution. It was a pledge that law would hold him in public view. The legal path ripped at things with a greedy efficiency. Contracts were voided. Accounts were frozen as the prosecutors sought to preserve funds for restitution. Dante saw assets he had once used to bend incentives lose liquidity in the name of pending forfeiture. His influence, previously a pliant thing in his hand, met the hard edge of subpoenas and judges.
Some of his old partners turned into accusers. Some remained languidly loyal in a way that surprised me for its selfishness. Marco's legal fate became an ugly public computation of the ethics of force. The investigator's office subpoenaed the key logs. They wanted to know who had opened which camera and at what times. They wanted to see if the house's ledger matched Dante's verbal confessions. There were moments amid the machine of litigation when I almost forgot the simple rules we had written at the start. I had to remind myself repeatedly, the agreement was mine as much as his. I had insisted on access and oversight because I did not want to be a talisman of someone else's redemption. There is something perverse in being the hinge of a scandal. People project onto you their longing for neat stories. Hometown girl redeems powerful man with simple love. And I had to refuse that ease. I had agency, and I used it. I told investigators what I knew. I refused to be a prop in a tale that might absolve actions without consequence. The mounting legal process made the private life public in ways that were less cinematic and more corrosive. Friends watched me in different roles, concerned, curious, opportunistic. Donors rescinded gifts or demanded transparency. People who had once called me to dinner now called with legal questions. My name became a hinge on which people's opinions turned. There were op-eds that read like verdicts, and there were whispers at galas that felt like needles.
And still, within this entropic pressure, we kept attempting the hard thing, to make repair something structural rather than theatrical. Dante, pressed by the DA and haunted by the gardener's memory of his mother, agreed to hand over a trust that would seed restitution and advocacy programs. It was not money laundering in reverse. It was an attempt to convert the means of influence into a public good. He arranged to put a tranche of funds into a foundation with independent oversight, the foundation that, in our conversations, would focus on survivors of the very networks he'd once deployed. This foundation was to be completely separate from his name. He wanted it to be a vehicle for repair, not indictment avoidance. I insisted that it had a board with voices that had been outside our circle, survivors, legal advocates, someone from the DA's office for oversight, and an accountant with no prior Dante connections. I insisted the charter include an annual external audit and an ombudsman who could take complaints confidentially. Rosa, with an eye for the moral machinery of households, suggested we start small. Legal clinics that taught people about their rights, hotlines, and support for people who had had their lives erased by payments and threats. I pushed for structural checks. No single person could appoint a board member. No single signature could disperse funds. The key motif, which had started as a private object on a rainy curb, became our shorthand for the foundation's ethos. Keys are not trophies, they are tools to be shared. There was backlash. People accused us of laundering reputation. It was a necessary accusation. Accountability needs to be tested by suspicion. We opened ourselves to those tests. Dante's pledge to donate and to give records became a public hedge against the narrative that a powerful man could buy his way out of shame. The DA's office watched the foundation's formation with a cautious optimism. They liked the checks and the transparency. They also kept their subpoenas moving. The press ate the drama in measures. One day the headlines celebrated the foundation as a bold act of restitution. The next, pundits demanded the length of time Dante should be allowed before he was punished. The city loves to put people into boxes and then debate whether they're redeemed. I learned to ignore the noise and to focus on the slow bureaucratic maintenance of change. Marco's case moved forward, a legal tide of interrogation and testimony. He had acted as a defender that night. He had also been someone who had earlier carried out tasks that belonged to another, meaner ledger. The prosecutor's office considered a range of charges. Marco took the stand once, and his voice was different than it had been in the kitchen the day we talked. He spoke of loyalty, of fear, of training. He admitted to past misdeeds in a way that suggested recognition rather than boasting.
The DA offered a plea arrangement, reduced charges in exchange for testimony against contractors and for cooperating in tracing payments. Marco agreed, but the bargain did not make him immune to the shame of culpability. He would lose certain freedoms for a time. He would be on public record as a man who had once chosen violence. There was more loss. A few of Dante's contractors were indicted and convicted at varying stages. Some fled and were later apprehended. Others quietly made deals. Assets were seized. People who had once been useful were now liabilities to the networks that had used them. The city, which had tolerated 1,000 moral evasions for the sake of convenience, watched as its ledger was reopened and read. Old money grew nervous. New alliances shifted. In the midst of that, there were small afternoons that felt perversely like repair. Dante and I argued about the Foundation's mission statements, the cadence of disclosures, and whether the board needed a survivor's veto on certain issues.
We sat in the study and argued like adults about the meanings of justice. He would sometimes put his hand on the key on my palm and ask soft questions about how to make the grant process less extractive. I would tell him frankly that restitution could not be performative, and that survivors needed long-term support, not headline-friendly scholarships. We fought about the language of victimhood and agency until our voices grew hoarse, and then went out to walk the garden because talking had exhausted us both. Repair is a series of mechanical acts and personal readjustments. We found small public rituals that had practical consequences: panels, listening sessions, funding for legal defense for people caught in criminalized networks who were victims of abuse rather than perpetrators. Rosa facilitated intake procedures that prioritized confidentiality and mental health. The foundation hired lawyers who had the stomach to litigate and the patience for advocacy. We built policies that made power less singular. There were moments of sorrow I can still taste. A man we once suspected of being erased by Dante's orders came forward with names of people who had been disappeared, some of them never found. The testimony was devastating. It required us to be present in a way that had nothing to do with headlines. It was just humans, their small and shattering histories, raw and asking for the ability to be seen. We listened, and the foundation tried to help. That is the work, the transform of raw grief into a structure that can nurture restitution without theater. The DA's process culminated in public hearings that read like civic rituals. Dante testified under oath. He told the story of his mother's death and the arithmetic that had led him to corruption and violence. He did not ask for sympathy. He used the hearings to lay out what he had done and what he would accept. The prosecutor asked about specific acts, payments, contractors, orders.
Dante answered in terms that were sometimes maddeningly incomplete and sometimes brutally clear. He named those he could and explained the limits of what he knew. He turned over accounts and promised to surrender management of certain trusts to an independent trustee. There are rules in the law about confession and plea. He accepted a plea that included restitution, the forfeiture of assets to a special fund, a period of restricted movement and supervision, and probationary oversight in lieu of the kind of long-term incarceration that might have been sought by the most vindictive voices. There were things he would lose: money, privacy, a certain kind of deference. There were things he would keep: the ability to work on the foundation as an advisor in a limited role and to take responsibility in public. That arrangement did not please everyone. Some wanted more, some wanted less. The DA's office, balancing public good and political reality, brokered a deal that sought to make repair plausible while also ensuring consequences. Marco's plea was part of the same tapestry. He took a deal that required community service, enrollment in a rehabilitation program for people trained in force, and supervised restrictions. He endured public scorn and private grief for what he'd done. He also testified against men who had been paid to erase others. His testimony helped convict some contractors. For his cooperation, he received a reduced sentence, but the knowledge of someone dead on a pavement never leaves entirely. Throughout all this, I kept the keys. At times they felt like a compass on a ship that had taken on water. At others they were a reminder that I had not been given shelter so that someone else could own me. In a small symbolic act, one that was, in truth, a legal step as much as a moral one, I placed one of my keys in the Foundation's secure vault, under the supervision of the board. It was not dramatic. It was a bureaucratic step to prove the Foundation's independence. The board signed the deposit. The key sat there, boring and ordinary, like evidence of an intention, that the institution we were forming was not under any single thumb. Months coagulate into years in legal time. The city moved through phases of fascination and forgetfulness. There were editorials and think pieces, but there were also survivors who used the Foundation to get help, lawyers who filed motions, and a small, slow arc of people getting restitution checks that did not erase what had been done, but at least acknowledged it. The Foundation built clinics. It taught people how to read contracts and how to protect their privacy. It funded legal teams that sought to reverse some of the harm that had been wrought when people vanished without hearings. The house changed too. Dante's influence no longer ran the city in ways that were secret. He had lost some of the private levers, accounts, the networked favors. His power looked from the outside like the diminished plot of a man whose instruments were partly taken. He showed up at hearings and meetings with the same scar and with less certainty. He sat with survivors when they asked hard things and did not always get the answers right. He learned how to sit with the discomfort of not being the solver. The hardest parts were the ones that looked domestic. We navigated the actual mechanics of living together and apart. There were check-ins, a redrafting of the consent form, an explicit clause about what would happen if either of us decided to step away. We decided that when Dante had to be away for court, I had the right to my own space without cameras that made me feel surveilled. He accepted that my name could be used in testimony and that I might be called to speak on behalf of the Foundation. He agreed that I would not be censored. We had negotiated these things months before in ink.
Now we inhabited the printed forms like people who had taken vows about the constraints of power. There were moments of tenderness that were not theatrical. Once, after a particularly brutal day in court, Dante came to the study and wrote my name on a small scrap of paper, an absurdly private act in a very public life, and folded it into my palm. "For the ledger you keep," he said, meaning both my practical insistences and the moral ledger I had forced him to open. He did not ask me to change. He did not ask me to forgive. He simply asked for a presence, and that is a small thing with big weight when you consider the demands of accountability. As the foundation matured, we insisted on independent oversight. The board grew teeth: a retired judge, a survivor advocate, an accountant with a strict regard for transparency, and a community organizer who had no patience for moral washing. We published our grants. We hired attorneys to fight on behalf of people damaged by extrajudicial networks. We funded public defenders in cases where victims had been misidentified as suspects by corrupt investigators. We built a small center where people could testify privately if they wished. It was not enough. It was something. The city watched, alternately intrigued and epidemic with cynicism. Sometimes officials used the foundation as a prop. Sometimes they sought to dismantle or defund programs that threatened entrenched interests. The work required vigilance. The keys, literal and metaphorical, continued to be our ritual. At the start of each board meeting, I would place one of the keys on the table as a reminder. We open things. We do not lock them without consent. The board eventually adopted the key as a logo for a small campaign, Keys to Agency. It was a modest campaign and looked naive in some lights, but it centered survivors' right to access and choice, and that is, in the end, what we insisted on. We all paid a price. Dante's social circle thinned.
There were restaurants that no longer accepted him, and galleries that would not show his projects. There were donors who rescinded millions, and allies who rationalized their silence. Marco's life was a narrower corridor now. He took work for organizations that provided oversight training. Rosa, inscrutable as ever, kept the house running and made choices about whom she would trust. She had, in her ledgered way, demanded integrity and gotten a world in return that included more paperwork and less myth. A year after the curb in the rain, the city held another charity dinner, the same kind of evening I had once entered in armor, now frayed and more real. The charity had agreed to host a panel about restitution and surveillance in the city's cultural institutions. I was invited to speak, as sternly as one can in a room that feeds off symbols. Dante would be present, but circumscribed. His role would be small and non-executive. The media buzzed with the kind of hunger only a city that thinks itself moral can feed upon. I considered not going. The tables, the lights, the ritual of reconciliation all carried a smell I could not bear, spectacle as atonement. But I also believed we had a responsibility to make visibility work for good. I had been, from the start, a woman who believed in choosing my own inconvenience rather than being arranged by others. I would not opt out simply because the city wanted drama. I would use the plate as a platform. The dinner was rich with people who wore influence like jewelry, and others who had enough grace to come without expectation. The hall smelled of lemon oil and expensive linen, and I thought for a second of the night when I had wanted only distance. I wore a plain black dress that did not apologize or boast. Dante arrived not with a retinue, but with a small legal counselor and a neutral observer from the foundation. He looked older in the luminous, uncompromising way public reckoning makes people age. He sat at a table not near mine, his presence deliberate and distant. After the speeches, we walked through the city together into night. At the curb, I paused. It was important to me that the final movement of the story not be a rerun of the old script. The city loves a scene. Lover leaves in triumph, or lover is led away in disgrace. I refused both. The lesson of the year had been about consent, about the right to choose one's own movement. He took my hand in the small, familiar way he had developed at the house, fingers fitting into the hollows they had come to know. He did not lead me. He did not clutch me. He walked like a man who had learned to measure his reach. When we reached the car, he turned to me and said quietly, "If you want to leave, you can." It was the same offer he'd made under an umbrella at the curb, but changed. Then it had been the offer of power disguised as shelter. Now it was an offer of agency, an invitation to share life with someone undergoing public consequence.
I thought about the ledger again, what it had cost and what it had spared. I thought about the men who had been named, the funds that now went to clinics, the survivors who had found a place to speak, and the lives damaged beyond pragmatic repair. I took his hand, slowly. and we walked to the car together. We were not taking refuge from the city. We were choosing a path in it, with its constraints and its light. There will be people who will say that in taking that step I forgave too much or too little. They are entitled to their certainties. I am not. I only know that my choice was not a surrender to him, but an embrace of the work that remained. Before I climbed in, I reached into my pocket and took out the 2 keys. I had worn one of them on a thin chain in recent months, less for fashion than as a private reminder of the contract we had built. I held the other between my fingers and looked at Dante. He watched me with the cautious intensity of a man who had been forced into accountability and had partly complied. "I keep them," I said. "They are not trophies. They are tools." He nodded and, with an almost furtive care, placed something else on the hood of the car, a small wooden box that contained a 3rd key, an ordinary key, its teeth worn, that opened a safe deposit he had used for the Foundation's records. He had had it catalogued and placed under joint control months before. Now he handed me the box because he wanted me to have custody at the moment we left together. It was a gesture he had learned to make after a year of law and testimony. It was modest and enormous at once. We got into the car, and the city hummed as it always had. Indifferent, reflective, prone to either forgetfulness or hyperjudgment. When the driver turned the wheel, I felt the key press into my palm like a question I had to answer again and again. The house that had sheltered me no longer held the same secrecy. The house's cameras were logged and audited, its men were no longer anonymous, and its owner had been turned into someone who had to answer in public. That was the point. And the cost. We drove through streets that had once seemed like a maze of advantages, and now looked like an atlas of obligations. Dante is subject to continuing oversight. His assets are partially sequestered. He will have to live with the knowledge that his love was not a salve, and his power was not absolution. Marco will, in time, carry the legal and social consequences of the shot he fired. Contractors have been prosecuted. Some names that were once invisible are now in court transcripts.
The Foundation is tentative and real, and survivors are its first priority. People who had once supported him have turned away, or joined the chorus of demand for stricter consequences. There is no tidy end, because accountability is not an event, it is a course. If you ever picture me as the woman who walked in and fixed things with a smile, let me stop you. I was tired when the rain met me on the curb. I agreed to go to his house because shelter sometimes looks like a practical choice, and because I wanted to test an experiment. Could attachment force a man of influence to be accountable? That experiment worked only in parts. It forced him to hand over keys and ledgers and names. It forced the law to wake up and to process crimes that had been tolerated. It forced me to keep the right to leave. In the end, when the city drafts the dictionary of our story, they will keep the headline they prefer: "Powerful man humbled by love." But the small, stubborn truth is less tidy. He was compelled by his attachment to a woman who refused to be owned, to let law breathe where secrecy had suffocated it. He gave up keys. He opened ledgers. He helped fund repair. He accepted a public accounting. I kept a key and placed others into institutions. We live among the consequences. We have learned a few things along the way. Consent is not a one-time stamp. It is a practice. Protection is not a permission to possess. The law, clumsy and slow, is our imperfect mechanism for translating grief into remedy. Power, when it wants to change, must submit to witnesses. And love, if you can call what we have that, must be measured against the demands of accountability. 1 year after the curb, walking into the city for yet another dinner, keys in my pocket, ledger present and heavy in our pockets both, Dante and I did not pretend we were healed. We only knew we had chosen to keep showing up. That may be, ultimately, the clearest form of fidelity there is, to show up for the hard list of things that will, in the long arc, make wrongs less likely to be repeated. If this story has a last image, let it be simple and stubborn. In the glove compartment of an ordinary car, folded in a small velvet pouch, sat 3 keys. One belonged to a house that used to shelter secrets, one belonged to a Foundation's vault, and one belonged to a woman who had the right to keep them or to set them down as she chose. The most powerful man in the city had a weakness, the socialite, and that weakness was not a beauty to be owned, but a refusal to be erased, and a relentless insistence that power answer for what it had done. We walked into night together because I chose to, shoulder to shoulder with the ledger of consequence between us. If this makes you curious about moral ambiguity and the difficulty of repair, subscribe for more stories like this, stories that refuse tidy endings and ask what work real accountability entails.